Well, welcome one and all to the program we call Illumination, coming from the library of Sunset Lodge number 369 in Santa Monica, California. By the way, people who are not in the States, might be other places or something, you don't know where Santa Monica is. Santa Monica is just west of Los Angeles on the beach side, as we like to call it. In fact, our lodge is located just a tad bit over a mile away from the beach and the world famous Santa Monica Pier. Anyway, we're here to talk about all things Masonic, whether it's principals, people, or teachers. We're just here for that. If you want to get in touch with us, the way to do it is to go to our website. That is sunsetmasoniclodge.org. sunsetmasoniclodge.org. And by the way, I'm Les Jones. I'm the host. I am also serving as the senior deacon of our lodge. Anyway, my guest to talk about things today is our good old producer, Michael Wamback. How you doing, my brother?
Hey, Les, really good. And looking forward to the show. It's always a lot of fun. So I think it's going to be a great one. And, I was thinking the other night we were doing our third degree.
Right.
And the last thing that we do is we always have the candidate, after he's had his third degree, sign the Constitution and bylaws of the lodge, the bylaws in particular. And it's the actual book that we started with back in 1905 in this lodge. So there's literally the signature of every member of our lodge that's been raised going all the way back there, our whole lineage. So it really got me thinking about some of the people that have belonged to the fraternity over the years and some of the fascinating stories. So I thought that might be a really fun topic for us to do tonight.
Let's do that. Now, why don't you start us off with it there, Brother Michael?
All right. Well, let's see. I think that one of the most important things really are, to me, the people that have really embodied Freemasonry and our
Right.
Masonic values
Right.
that we've had over the years. And there's been some really great examples of that. But the ones that come to my mind in particular, I think that Alexander the Great, and obviously a pretty important person. And when he was the head of Russia, there's a wonderful story about him. And one of the vows we take as Masons is that we're to take care of our widows. And Masons take that pretty seriously. We're always trying to make sure they don't become destitute and that they're cared for if something happens to their husband. And that was a big founding principle of Freemasonry in general, going all the way back to the stonemason guilds, because again, a lot of the Masons would get injured or killed on the job, and there'd be no one to take care of their families. So the Masons formed these guilds and bonded together as a way of doing that. So the story goes that Alexander the Great was in this pawn shop, and he was sort of in disguise, so nobody knew it was him. And there was a widow of a brother Mason who was in there and trying to pawn the ring of her Masonic ring of her deceased husband. And the guy that was on the shop was a Mason, and he was really trying to shortchange her, offering very little for the ring. And Alexander the Great revealed himself and read the guy the riot act, which I can only imagine must have been a lot of fun if Alexander the Great was there in front of you, letting you know that you were in big trouble with him. And then he gave her money out of his pocket and said in the future, should she need anything, she was to present herself at the palace, and he personally would see that she was taken care of. So a man that, really uplived and lived the principles of Freemasonry to the greatest extent possible. And I thought that was really cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No,
there.
go ahead.
No, what I want to bring up to is the living principles of Masonry. I think that shows a lot right there. Why don't you delve a little bit into some of our founding fathers? Many of our founding fathers were Masons, weren't they?
Yeah, we absolutely. Washington and Jefferson, many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Paul Revere. If we really look at it, the American Revolution, again, a big part of the success of that was the Masonic connections that these people had. And the Jefferson spent a great deal of time in France with Masons he was connected with there. And of course, the French were a huge part of supporting America during the Revolutionary War. And if it weren't for those Masonic connections and alliances, maybe the outcome would have been very different. And then also the idea of trust. And Masons, we do take an obligation to care for one another and be loyal to one another. And during the Revolutionary War, I don't know if you know this, Les, but with Washington, his personal bodyguard, the only people he would trust with his life were Freemasons. So all of his personal bodyguard were members of the fraternity. So I always thought that was pretty cool.
That really is great. All right. Now, there were a lot of people that really showed Masonic principles, whether they were Masons or not, and how they gave back to the community. One person in particular I wanted to speak about was Henry Ford.
Yeah, I mean, here again, you have a person who's pretty important in industrial America. And I can't even imagine, Ford if he hadn't existed, because again, a lot of the modern mechanization and assembly line and creating an affordable automobile. And if you think about how important that was to the development of our country, mobilization,
Yes.
we see that during the Second World War with Hitler creating the Volkswagen, because he believed that if he could mobilize the population of Germany, it could pull them out of the Depression. So, because when people can get around, they obviously have a lot more opportunity to find employment and work and better themselves. And so Ford, created the Model A and the Model T, the very affordable cars. But again, one of the things about him was that he actually paid his workforce substantially more than he had to. And he did that, he said, first of all, because he wanted to have a market for his cars. So paying them, he had people that could buy them.
Right.
But I think that there was some Masonic principle in that too, that he had the opportunity to alleviate suffering and make sure people were well taken care of. And I think as a Mason that spoke to him on some level, and I always believe that was part of that decision also. So again, we see that in action, where a lot of times Masons will go above and beyond, and not just for other Masons, but for anyone in need, and will come through. I mean, we see that today in the Midnight Mission downtown, that one of our past grandmasters here, Larry Adamson, used to run the Midnight Mission for many, many years. And so it's one of those things where it was started by a Mason and his daughter. They saw the homeless people out there at night, and they opened their doors to them and took them in at midnight and gave them a safe place to sleep. And it's become an incredible organization over the years. And Masons are still very involved in running that. So, and of course, many of the people we're helping have nothing to do with the fraternity, but they're suffering and in need. And the Masons are going out of their way to try and alleviate that in our society. Right. Another person who I think embodied that in his writing was Charles Dickens. And again, we look at some of the themes in his writing. Now, from what I understand, he himself was not a Mason, but his brothers were. And so he was obviously very exposed to the philosophy and the ideals of Masonry. And I've often thought, again, some of the aspects where he's talking about alleviating the suffering of the poor. And there's so much emphasis on charity in many of his writings, whether it's Oliver Twist or, of course, Scrooge and A Christmas Carol, very Masonic in many ways.
Oh, yes.
So again, I think that there was a big part of that in the way that they viewed the world, and the whole idea of the Age of Enlightenment, that very much took root in a lot of Masonic lodges, Voltaire and people like that believed in a better world and how to create that. And I think that Masonry is a part of that on some level. I think that the principles and the values and the lessons taught in the degrees, I think, are what shaped a lot of their thinking.
Well, thank you. And just want to pause for a moment and let you know you're listening or watching, either way, the program Illumination from the library of Sunset Lodge number 369 in Santa Monica, California. My name is Les Jones. Our guest and producer is Brother Michael Wamback. If you want to get in touch with us, please, our web address is sunsetmasoniclodge.org. Sunsetmasoniclodge.org. We're here most Tuesdays at 6:30, when we eat from 6:30 to 7:30. If you're a Brother Mason, we'd love to see you. If you're not, just want to find out more about us, please feel free to come by and ask whatever questions you want, or just come by and just have a good time with us. We'd love to see you. Now, as time goes on in history, you brought up somebody that I thought was kind of interesting, Joseph Brant. Can you tell us a little bit about him and what he does?
I mean, Joseph Brant, I think, is one of those characters, again, that maybe a lot of people are not familiar with. But he was a Mohawk chief during the French and Indian Wars in the 1700s. And he was a Freemason. He was actually made a Mason by King George himself. He actually went to England and got his Masonic degrees there, and King George himself presided over the degrees. So, and he took his Masonry very, very seriously. It was very important to him. So there's this incredible story about him that they'd captured a prisoner, and the prisoner was going to be tortured and executed. And it was not the best of times when it came to being captured in those days. I think that it was a barbaric time in our history, although I suppose some people would argue we're not far from that these days in many respects too. But certainly in those days, it wouldn't have been a good thing. And this guy, Masons, we have I think many people know this, that there's ways of letting it be known that you're a Mason, and that we are. So here's this guy in this Indian village who's about to be executed. And he's surrounded by Native Americans, and he gives the secret signal that he's a Freemason, to sort of in the vain hope that somebody will recognize it. And lo and behold, against all odds, Joseph Brant is a Freemason. And so he recognizes this, and he orders a halt to the execution. He takes him under his own care to return him to his family. So as they're going about their business of returning this guy to his family, lo and behold, it turns out that he was never a Freemason, that he had friends who were Freemasons, and as they were drinking a little too much, they'd let slip some of the secrets, and he'd sort of caught on to it. Right. So rather than get upset, Joseph Brant took money out of his own pocket and paid for his Masonic degrees, figuring if he already knew the secrets, he should at least obligate him to keep them secret.
That's true.
so the guy made it all right. But it just goes to show the reach that the fraternities had over the years, where even in a Native American village in the 1750s, the chances that one of the natives there is a Freemason, and the chief himself, obviously, it's pretty remarkable when you think about it. And when you look at history, the impact that this organization has had on the world, in so many respects, culture, sports, literature, industrialism, military stuff, science, just on and on and on. And I like to think that really when you look at it, so much of our modern society was shaped by Freemasons in so many different ways, Yes. And so I think you see this, but it's really remarkable, some of these stories that we have. And there's some really other great stories about, different times during wars where Freemasonry came into play as well.
We were talking about that. Tell us about you've got a couple of stories about the Civil War time, don't you?
Yeah, I think really there are some really cool stories that stem from that. And one of the things that's interesting about the Civil War as a whole, of course, is you end up with brother against brother. So on both the North and the South, there were Freemasons. And so it was a time in our history where it was American versus American, and people were very divided, and often people that probably had friendships that ended up on both sides of that conflict. So it was a really interesting time in our history in many respects. But there were a couple of stories that came to my mind that are fascinating, and again kind of show how Freemasonry can even transcend conflict in a sense, and should, in so many respects. But there was a story about this guy who was from the North, and he was captured in Savannah in Georgia, and was in a prisoner of war camp there. And he was a second-degree Freemason, a fellowcraft. And his lodge in Michigan actually contacted the lodge in Savannah and said, look, we have this dude sitting there in your prison camp. He's only got his second degree, and we were hoping that he could get his third degree. Is there any way you could help us out with that? And so, of course, the lodge in Savannah said, sure, we'll be happy to give him his third degree for you. So they went down to the prison camp, and they got the guy out, and they took him down to the lodge, and presiding over the degree were basically Union officers in their gray uniforms. And here he is in his tattered blue Northern uniform and of the Union, and he's getting his Masonic degree from all these Confederate generals and officers. And so after he gets his third degree and becomes a Master Mason, of course, they have a celebratory meal and whatnot, a little banquet in his honor. And after which they're taking him back to the prisoner of war camp. And according to history, somehow miraculously he managed to escape.
My goodness.
And I believe there was a story that he credited it in later years to someone named Hiram, that he was able to escape.
There you go.
But anyway, he did manage to escape miraculously and made his way back to his family. And I think there was maybe a little more going on to it than just his cleverness at that point.
Yeah, I think so.
So that was cool. And then there's another story that always stuck with me too, and I don't know if you've heard, but a famous story that during one of the naval engagements, and the Union ships were bombarding the southern position, and the southern forts, of course, firing back. And so during the battle, one of the officers on the Union ship was killed. And he was a Freemason, and they wanted to bury him with the Masonic ritual. And Masons have a Masonic funeral ritual that we have, and they wanted him buried with his Masonic honors. So they kind of let it be known and put up a flag of truce and let it be known to the Union side that this was the situation. And the Union soldiers actually called a ceasefire for 24 hours so the person could be buried with both sides attending, and then went back to fighting again.
Wow.
So it was actually something where they did call a truce to actually literally make sure this person was taken care of properly. And I remember another story too, that it just so many come flooding back to my mind that I don't know, you may have heard this one too in San Francisco, that back in the day, a body washed ashore and they took it, he drowned, they took him to have his autopsy done, and when they removed the clothing, he was covered in Masonic tattoos. And when the Masons in San Francisco heard about it, they went down and claimed the body and made sure he got a proper burial. They never did identify him. They have no idea who he was, but they just assumed because he was all covered in Masonic tattoos that he was a brother Mason, and they wanted to make sure he was properly taken care of. So there's this incredible, brotherhood and charity to Freemasonry that I think more so in a sense, other organizations have fraternity and fellowship and so forth, but I think the Masonry is just a different level.
Right.
And I've often believed that it's such a different level that we see this, that maybe no other organization really has, to so many degrees.
I know exactly what you mean. And one of the things I love about what you've been talking about is that it's not just among ourselves, but we take that very same spirit and share it with the world. So it's not just us only, us against them, but we actually do share it with the world.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think that there is just something to it, and of course we have a long history going back to, I think we have Masonic documents back to the 1400s, and of course, the modern Masonry really came into being with the Grand Lodge of England forming in the early 1700s. But again, we have such a long lineage, and I think that this is all such a part of that in so many ways.
Real good. And, there are many types of Masons. We've been talking about it. By the way, I want to remind you, you're watching or listening to the program Illumination from the library of Sunset Lodge number 369 in Santa Monica, California. My name is Les Jones. I serve as the senior deacon of our lodge. If you want to get in touch with us, just look us up on the web. The address is sunsetmasoniclodge.org. sunsetmasoniclodge.org. We're here most Tuesday nights starting at 6:30 when we eat. We'd love to see you. Now, there's there are many different phases of Masonry, many different things you could study. One of the things I wanted to bring up to you is something called esoteric Masonry. Someone like the author Manly P. Hall. What do you have to say? What do you know about someone like him?
Well, again, this is what sets us, I think, apart from so many other similar organizations, is it's not just the fellowship and the brotherhood, but there is this incredibly deep esoteric aspect to Freemasonry. People who have contributed so heavily to that and studied its symbolism over the years. And Manly Hall's a great example. He's someone that was here in Los Angeles, with the Philosophical Research Society in Los Feliz. He was the founder of that. He was a wealthy man. He traveled the world. He gathered together all these ancient texts. He had a Gutenberg Bible. He had, all these incredibly old, texts and whatnot that he acquired with his library. I don't know if you know, but his library was actually acquired by the Getty Center.
No.
And so actually it exists now at the Getty Center, and you can actually go to the Getty Center and still peruse a lot of the books that he collected over the years. But Manly Hall, again, he sort of took all of this study that he'd done and all this research and all these texts and compiled it into a book called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And it's one of those books that every coffee table should have, especially the really massive version of it. It's just beautiful. And it touches briefly on so many different teachings, from the Western esoteric stuff, the Egyptian stuff, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, all these different schools of mystery teachings. And it sort of compiles it all into sort of one text. And it's a sort of a foundation text and to just touch on all these different topics. But Manly Hall actually held Masonry in the highest regard. He always felt Freemasonry was it. It was the such high esteem that he held it. But he was so busy, he never got around to joining until he was very elderly.
I didn't realize that.
And he didn't actually join Freemasonry until very late in his life, and he actually came to it. But when he joined and got his third degree, and then he actually joined the Scottish Rite. And one of the interesting things about that was they immediately made him a 33rd degree Mason based on his life work and all the teachings he'd done and so forth. And so, a remarkable character.
Now, another.
And then,
oh, go ahead. I'm
No,
sorry.
go ahead.
No, I was going to bring up Crowley. What do you know about Crowley?
Yeah.
That was the one name I wrote down here that I wanted to bring up to you.
Yeah, I mean Crowley and Waite and those guys. If we go back to some of the people during that incredible time of esoteric thought, and I've often thought one of those great golden ages was sort of that Victorian time when it came to. Maybe people were just better educated in those days and all these things for some reason, but it was certainly just an incredible time in esoteric stuff. And again, Arthur Waite, who we now think of with the tarot deck, the Waite tarot deck, and he was a contemporary of Crowley's. He was very much a Freemason. He's written actually a number of books on Freemasonry, and so a lot of he studied extensively some of the symbolism and the esoteric stuff. And of course, a lot of that influenced his development of the tarot deck that he's known for as well. And then, of course, Crowley. And Crowley is obviously one of the biggest and most controversial names in all of esoteric stuff. And he is and sort of isn't a Freemason in the sense that he joined several Masonic organizations, none of which were properly recognized. So some Masons don't consider him a Masons. Others say, well, yes, he was. I think he was a member, as I recall, of the Grand Orient of France, who was always on the outs with the Grand Lodge of England over some of the ritual. I think he maybe belonged to an organization in Mexico at one point, too. Crowley was actually here on the West Coast in Los Angeles for a part of his latter life. But again, it would be really hard to think of esoteric study without those kind of guys, and Masonry was a part of what influenced them. Now, again, whether the esoteric stuff, I don't know if it stems from Freemasonry or if Masonry borrowed from it or how it all came about, but there certainly is that strong correlation. And in our degrees, when people go through our degrees, there's a strong esoteric component to it. Some Hermeticism, some Kabbalah philosophy that finds itself into the degree. And I think that if you're a student of that, you'll see things in the degrees that are incredibly familiar. And I think that it made people like this that were very into this esoteric aspect of life feel very at home in our degrees. And I think that's where a lot of that comes from.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. And one last final thing I want to bring up. We were talking about mainly the politicians. There are many. How many of our presidents have been Masons?
Good question. I think 13, as I recall. Might be wrong. We had a couple of others that were close. I know that the last one that was a Freemason, as I recall, was Gerald Ford.
Right.
First one was Washington, obviously, and the last one was Ford. I know that Clinton, his father was a Freemason, and he was actually a member of the De Malay, which was the Masonic Youth Order. And he actually credits the De Malay with giving him a lot of his ability to develop his public speaking skills. And a lot of the lessons he learned in the practice he got in the Order of De Malay, he credited that to his skills as an order that helped him become president. And again, whether these people flock to Freemasonry because there's something that they recognize in it of value, I suspect. Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, again, a very important Freemason, and incredible, interesting person.
Harry Truman.
Harry Truman.
Yes.
It just really goes on and on and on. The list. But I also think that some of these people were not just presidents, but some of the best presidents that we've had in so many respects. Roosevelt in particular. Right. He was elected to 4 terms or something, yes. And he would have been elected to 4 more if they hadn't put term limits on him to get rid of him. So it was. And you think about the person who really dragged this country out of the Depression, who advanced it so much in terms of its welfare. It's hard to think of a president better than Roosevelt, that was capable of that. And I think the Masonic stuff he took very proudly. Oh, a quick story about him. I don't know if you know this. Since we're telling stories tonight, is that, and we talk about Masonry where all men are equal. And whether you're the president, whether you're not, once you step into a Masonic lodge, equality is one of the themes, that all men are created equal. And again, the Declaration of Independence, many people think is a Masonic document in the way it lays things out, but there is that sense of equality. So there's a story about Roosevelt that when he was president, that his gardener was a Freemason and a past master of the local lodge. And occasionally Roosevelt, as president, would still sneak in and visit the lodge from time to time in Washington. So one night he shows up at the lodge, and the master is away or sick or something that night, and his gardener's filling in as master. So during the ritual, the President of the United States had to refer to his gardener as worshipful sir. His master was the gardener. So at the White House. So really fascinating stuff. J. Edgar Hoover, another famous name that comes to mind, that was a Mason during those times. So again, pretty influential people for sure.
And there's a lot of lot of good stuff, but there's a lot of fun stuff. I remember watching a talk show where Shaquille O'Neal was on, and he had a big, fancy, bling Masonic ring on, and they were questioning him. And he said, "Of course I am. Shaq's one of us, so to speak."
Yeah, very much. He joined the Freemasons in Florida during his time that he was there. Now, his path is a little interesting, is that one of the things I don't know if everyone knows is that Grand Masters have the power to make a Mason at sight, which basically means that you can bypass all of the degrees and they just basically say, "You're a Master Mason, I recognize you as such," and you immediately become a Master Mason. And it's a power that only the sitting Grand Master, past Grand Masters don't have it, any other member of the fraternity doesn't have it, but the sitting Grand Master at the time has that power. And in Shaq's case, that's exactly what happened, that he actually met Shaq somewhere, and Shaq expressed an interest in becoming a Freemason. He said, "Poof, you're a Mason," and immediately became a Mason overnight, and instantly a Mason at sight. So that's how he came to be a Mason. But again, very proud of it. And then I don't know if you know, there's an interesting connection with Shaq, that actually James Naismith, who was the Canadian who invented basketball, was a Freemason. So I guess, it's things come full circle in so many respects. And so, in sports, we have so many people that were part of the fraternity. So it's really cool, and he is proud. And I think also, if you look at Shaq, he is very much an upstanding pillar of the community, not just in sports. He's a person that has invested back and given his time back to the community. He's an individual who's always, I remember when they had the riots after the Lakers won the championship, and one of the LA police cars was torched, that he actually bought the LAPD a new police car. And I think he actually worked for a while as a deputy sheriff or something. So again, very much an outstanding person who believes in bettering society and giving back. So, which, is not surprising that the Masonic philosophy finds a home with someone like that.
That's awesome. And you've got a couple of other funny stories about sports that you might want to share? Do you have those? You seem to have a lot of good stories.
I don't know if I have too many stories about sports and Freemasonry. I mean, there were a lot of, Ty Cobb, there were a lot of different people that were Freemasons that were involved in sports. Again, going back in history, Hillary that climbed Mount Everest was a Mason. We have so many people that have shaped our world, as I said, and entertained us over the years. From Bud Abbott, from Abbott and Costello, Harry Houdini, on and on and on, as I said. The fraternities had a big impact in our world and so many levels, and maybe beyond what a lot of people even realize on a day-to-day basis. But that there's endless stories, and I think we could spend all night, telling stories for sure. In our own lodge, here at Sunset, I don't know if you know this story, but one of our past masters, and unfortunately the name eludes me, I'll have to go look at the pictures on the wall and point them out to you afterwards, but he actually played football with the Green Bay Packers back in the day, and he was the other person besides our good friend Clifton, who was a Choctaw. So we've had two Native American past masters in our lodge. And when he passed away, he had his funeral, and a lot of players showed up, and one of them was Dick Butkus that actually came to his funeral, so pretty interesting characters. So even our lodge has had several really interesting people as part of its history. And the fraternity as a whole, it's just endless. I suggest anyone that's interested, go to Wikipedia, type in famous Freemasons, and just scroll the list, and it's just endless. You'll be there for hours. And some of them, again, maybe names younger people won't recognize, some they will. But a pretty amazing group of people for sure.
By the way, and we've gone over some really, really great people here. I just want to ask you, which Mason has had the most influence on you in your life?
I don't know if I can answer that question, to be honest. I think it's a cumulative thing. I think all of them to a degree, because I think they all share the same thing. They all share that belief that we should be laboring to make the world a better place. And you see that in so many of them that I admire and respect, from the second man to set foot on the moon to you name it. But just outstanding individuals. And I think people that have gone above and beyond to make our society a better place, our world a better place. And I'm just grateful for all of them for having existed. As I said, it's our lineage. And I think I'm a part of that lineage. And so I see it more as a lineage, a collective lineage, than individual people.
That's awesome. Well, we've gone over some really wonderful things here. I appreciate your help with this, Brother Michael. This has been really, really a good show today. I learned a lot myself along the way. And by the way, if you want to reach us, be sure and go to the web and look up our web address. It's sunsetmasoniclodge.org. sunsetmasoniclodge.org. And we'd love to see you come by. We're here on Tuesdays at 6:30. Until next week, I'm Les Jones, your host, the Senior Deacon here. Have a great one.